All right, today we're going to talk about Mor Zokhe, and it's the same name for Saint Nicholas. And we're going to trace the history how eventually became Santa Claus. So this presentation will explore the Syriac narrative of the origins of Saint Nicholas, or what we call it in Aramaic, we call him Mor Zokhe. So from Mor Zokhe to eventually how it became Santa Claus. So we will begin by examining the roots of the story. Of course, Saint Nicholas is a Greek name, Greek East, but have Aramaic origins to the story. Then we're going to speak about the story of Saint Nicholas, the three knights. We're going to emphasize on Syriac mindset of silence and secrecy in giving gifts, which Saint Nicholas had done and learned from the Syriac. We're going to speak about the Latin West and how the idea of Saint Nicholas transferred to Italy in the 11th century and emerging of the gift giving, and then how it merged to Dutch tradition, to Europe from Sinterklaas, and it was Americanized by transferring the name from Santa Claus in Dutch to Santa Claus and American modernization. So we can trace the history. But first of all, Mor Zokhe. Mor in Syriac tradition literally means Lord or Holy One or respected teacher. Mor or Mar is the same thing, East or West. And you see here, Mim in Aramaic, Wow, and Resh, Mor, Zokhe. These are the vowels. This is Zain, Skofo, Zo, and then Che or Kuf, but there's a dot below, Che, and Olaf, Aleph, in the end is Wow in Western Aramaic. So Mor Zokho or Mor Zokhe. Again, Mor means Lord, Master, Teacher, Honor. And in Hebrew, it's Mar. It's a title. And actually, it's all the way back to Ugaritic, ancient Mesopotamian language. And from its origin is Mar. And I believe it's in English taken from Mr., but its origins is from the East. Again, Mar or Mor signifies holiness and respect for someone or for deity in ancient Mesopotamian culture. Now, Zokhe, from the Semitic root, Zain Kuf youth, meaning pure or innocent, or means righteousness, or in modern Greek language, victorious. Saint Nicholas. Nicholas from the god Nike, which literally became the word victorious, but in Aramaic is Zokhe, which means victorious, related to winning or related to moral excellence. So when we put the two words together, Mor Zokhe, in the Semitic Aramaic word, holiness is framed through the lens of compassion, empathy, or another layer, entering someone else's suffering to bring them hope and joy through righteousness and acts of gifts and generosity and social responsibility. This is the idea of Mor Zokhe, where later developed into Santa Claus. It's about compassion. It's a heartfelt and spontaneous act of generosity in a secretive way. So when you give, you're considered to be Mor Zokhe. And it's not abstract philanthropy. It's not only philanthropy. It's not only like in the Greek mindset, but when you give, it's deeper than that. It's about a gut felt mercy. When you have compassion, when your gut or spirit start to work, you give from your heart. Because people in ancient times, this is Semitic way of thinking, they thought their minds were in their stomachs or in their guts when they felt it. You know, sometimes when you're feeling in trouble, or if you feel your guts have like some emotions. So this is how they thought, but with compassion. It's even like hidden righteousness. It's emphasized the true righteousness, and the true giving occurs in secrecy, away from public attention. Like in the West, when they give the public attention to recognize their name. And this is why Mor Zokhe had done things and he did not want anyone to see. We have a lot of Syriac homilies, a lot of writings that speaks about Mor Zokhe as the archetype of the hidden giver, whose charity is motivated by spiritual purity rather than recognition or rather than a reward. So, this is a Semitic moral lens more than Greek. So St. Nicholas is depicting Mor Zokhe. And the Syriac tradition always give priorities to honor and dignity through being secretive. While Western narratives, the Greek ones, may focus more on the virtue of public recognition when you give something. Now, this is not right or wrong. I'm not comparing who's right or wrong. I'm telling you how the idea of giving in Christmas started with Mor Zokhe. He was a very generous guy. And Syriac accounts always emphasize in secret charity and humility. And this reflects a lot of cultural values. Because silence is portrayed as virtue that protects the purity of charity and respect the dignity of the recipient or the other, emphasizing inward spirituality over outward recognition. So it's deeper when you give and no one knows and sees it, only the Father in heaven. So this is what we call in Syriac the hidden righteousness, and this is what Zokhe means. And it's very important characteristic in Syriac spirituality. This is the true virtue without public claim. Anyway, now the story speaks about Mor Zokhe, or the same name, Saint Nicholas, began in Myra. Myra is located in south of Minor Asia here, and this is like where his legacy of mercy and generosity was established. And Myra was a prominent city in the Roman province of Lucia. Here we see Lucia in the map, and this is what today is Turkey, but here is the promised land, here the land of the Bible. But at one time before Turkey, it was Greek. And before Greek, there was a lot of Assyrian Christians. Syriac Christianity here spread with the early church. We have Tur Abdin up in the north. We have a lot of Mardin, another town here, Aramaic town. And even in Lucia, there was an Aramaic town called Patara. By the way, St. Nicholas is traditionally said to have been born in Patara here. And this is another seaport in Lucia. But Patara is important because it's the birthplace, again, of St. Nicholas. Anyway, Patara is known in the Bible. This is it's a seaport city, and you see here the sea, and this is the town itself. And in the first century, it was a big Roman city. And it's mentioned in the Bible. It's connected to St. Paul in the Acts of Apostles. It functioned as one of the major Mediterranean port cities in Asia Minor. Acts 21, 1 and 2, it says, "We came to Patara, and having found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we embarked." So it records that Paul landed at Patara during the return from the third mission journey. And if the Apostle Paul used that Patara seaport during his missionary travel, it means that he spent time there. You can't go from one ship to another so quick in ancient times. So it was a Martima seaport and a transfer, and he wanted a much more solid ship. And we know he boarded a larger vessel, a ship made by Phoenicians, right, from Tyre, because it's much more safety, because the Phoenicians were known to make these big ships. So probably he spent some time in Patara, and probably he met with some believers, Jewish believers. He probably went to the synagogue of Patara, and he was speaking Hebrew. And this is the first, probably, what effect of Paul had done in South Asia. And probably he spoke about Jesus. And probably there were Phoenicians, and then Phoenicians are Aramaic followers, and probably Mor Zokhe was there also. We don't know if their family is connected or they met, or anyway, it was a gateway port to the Levant. Despite the story of Saint Nicolas is in the 4th century, but the story of Saint Paul is 1st century, and there is 300 years, probably Mor Zokhe was developed during that time, because both they intersect in geography. Anyway, so the point I want to make that Saint Nicholas, 4th century Greek, born in Patara and later became Bishop of Myra, probably they got connected in a way or another. So in the ancient tradition, I'm going to tell you about the childhood of Saint Nicholas, that from his birth, he was special. His life was filled with holiness. He was born to a devout parents, with the only son of pious parents. His father's name was Theophanes, all Greek names, and his mother was Tona. They didn't have any other kids. He was the only son. And because of that, they gave him a vow to dedicate him to God. And this infant, Nicholas, from the very day of his birth, revealed to people the light of his future as a wonder worker, miracle worker. His mother, Tona, the story said, after giving birth, was immediately healed from her illness. And as a child, he was described to be very calm, quiet. And as an infant, he showed tenderness of heart toward like people who's visiting him. We have a lot of Syriac writers say he grew in wisdom as a lamb kindled early, meaning that from his earliest years he displayed compassion, gentleness, and a love for prayer. And these virtues became the foundation for the generous and courageous heart that he had, that later these characteristics made him to be a bishop of Myra. And we have a lot of early hieroglyphics, traditions, writings, and it speaks about, even in Syriac we have these writings, and it speaks about that from he as an infant, he manifested signs of divine favor. And the moment he was brought to baptism here as a kid, and inside this like font, and the child, this Syriac script said that he had stood upright by himself, unaided, without any help, lifting himself from the priest's arms as though declaring his own will to receive the sacred mystery of baptism. So that was a wondrous act for a young infant. And the Syriac sources describe that the posture of one strengthened by the Spirit was interpreted by the church as a prophetic act, that the boy would grow into a shepherd of purity, discipline, and that marked from the beginning as a vessel of this kid was special. And from the time of his childhood also. Saint Nicholas or Mor Zokhe thrived on the study of divine scripture. By day he would not leave the church, and by night he prayed and read so many books, and he fashioned in himself a worth-dwelling place of the Holy Spirit. His uncle was the Bishop Nicolas of Patara, rejoiced at the spiritual success and deep piety of this young boy. And also, from a young age, he ordained him as a reader in the church and elevated Nicolas to the dignity of a priest, making him his assistant and entrusting him to speak, teach, and instruct all the flock. Now, there was a pilgrimage that the bishop had set to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, and the bishop of Patara, entrusted the guidance of the flock to Saint Nicholas, who fulfilled this obedience carefully and with love. And along the way, the story says that the Saint Nicholas predicted that a storm will take place in the ship. And because he declared that he saw the devil itself having got on the ship, and in front of the pilgrims, he calmed by his prayers the waves of the sea. And through his prayers, also he restored to health a certain sailor of the ship who had fallen from the mast and was almost dying and injured, and he was healed because of St. Nicholas' prayers. And having reaching the ancient city of Jerusalem and having come to Golgotha is the place of resurrection, St. Nicholas offered up thanksgiving to the Savior Jesus, and he made the rounds and he visited all the holy places in the Holy Land, worshiping God and making prayers. And he connected so much with the wilderness, and he wanted to stay there to have a monastic life. And you know, during the 4th century, that was the rise of the monastic life. If you're pious and holy, you want to separate yourself and stay in the wilderness. That was common. But he was stopped by the Holy Spirit voice, urging him to return back to his own native country, back to Patara, because he had a mission to do there. And the angel of the Lord approached the archbishop at that time, which was his relative, and told him that the next bishop will be chosen is Nicholas himself. So they took St. Nicholas and made him bishop over the city of Myra, and St. Nicholas remained a great ascetic, appearing to his flock as an image of gentleness, kindness, and love towards people. And that was great for the Lycian church during the time, because there was so much persecution of Christians in the 3rd century and early 4th century at the time of Emperor Diocletian, 284 AD to 305. And Bishop Nicolas at that time was encouraging all the believers against that persecution. And he ended up in prison together with other Christians. He sustained them, and he had bravery to endure the punishment and torture. But the Lord himself preserved him unharmed. And when Emperor Constantine came to the scene and Christianity was adopted in the Roman Empire, St. Nicholas and all the Christians that were persecuted were released and restored and back to their life. So they were joyful, and because they were guided during persecution by St. Nicholas, and he stood with them until things get normal. Anyway, the best known story about St. Nicholas, probably you know about, concerns his charity towards a poor man who was unable to provide dowries for his 3 daughters when they wanted to get married. By the way, dowries, married, this is a Semitic story. It's not a Greek story. It's more Semitic. It's more, anyway, Aramaic, because that's the culture of the Middle East. Anyway, so this is why I say Mor Zokhe, because it's remembered more in the Syriac culture before it became Greek. So the story of the 3 gifts of gold is rooted in Syriac literature, Aramaic literature. And these are local traditions and theological concepts. But it provides so much insights into the historical context of Middle Eastern Christianity. Anyway, the story reflects very Semitic ethical concerns. And the story speaks about protection of family honor. This is a Middle Eastern mindset, and where secrecy is giving preserves the dignity of the family. So he was coming and putting gold and giving money. Like 3 nights he came and he gave money for the girls. And the father was very poor and didn't know what to do. So we call this what the act, and this is very Syriac, hidden charity. This is the highest form of charity, that which no one sees except God. And this is what Saint Nicholas had done. And he is famous, or Mor Zokhe. Mor Zokhe literally means the hidden giver. And this title, the hidden giver, is only read in Syriac traditions. So the bottom line, he's protecting the honor of the daughters. This is a Syriac culture, Middle Eastern honor codes, saving the dignity of the family. It's not about giving the money. It's deeper than that. It's restoring the honor of the family before restoring their wealth. Let me tell you the story. So St. Nicholas' secrecy tossed a bag of gold. You see here, this is from the window. No chimneys like what you think yet. From the window, he came at night and he threw a bag of gold through the poor man's on 3 separate occasions, which means 3 separate nights. First night, his steps were as soft as the dew on vines, because this is how secret he was doing it. He threw a pouch of gold wrapped in linen through this window, all right? And this is the 3 girls, and this is the poor father. The father found it at dawn in the morning, and he was so happy. He rejoiced, and he used it for the eldest daughter, Dori. Second night, same thing happened. So Nicolas or Mor Zokhe came to the window. He returned back very silently with another pouch, and in the dawn, another daughter was saved. But by now, the father began to suspect the identity of this mysterious benefactor. Who was that? And the third night, St. Nicholas came again. And some Syriac resources say that he wept as he approached the third time, because he did not want to be discovered. But this time, the father waited in secret. He was watching, all right? And immediately, when he felt the drop of the sack from the window, he ran out of the house to the door to see who was throwing the gold to him, and caught Nicholas in the act. The father fell to his knees and cried, because he saved his daughters from poverty and from life of sin. And he told him, "You are the angel whom God has sent." And Nicholas told him, "Do not reveal this to anyone while I live." So this is the Syriac mindset, Middle Eastern humility, hidden righteousness, the blessing of quiet charity. And Nicholas did not want any praise, no human glory. And Nicholas refused to accept any thanks and asked the father to thank the Lord who put this thought in his heart, and this enabling the daughters to be married, and by this saved the family from falling into spiritual destruction. So in doing charity, St. Nicholas always strove to do this secretly and concealed his good deeds. And over the centuries, this particular legend evolved into the custom of gift giving on the saint's feast. By the way, when I speak a legend, in the Western mindset, a legend is only a story that might not happen. But a legend in the Eastern mindset is a real story, but it was taught or it was learned from one generation to another generation to make a point, and that story is true. A legend in Middle Eastern mindset is the truth, but the story is told in a metaphor, but it happened in history. So legends is dependent on how cultures see it. So any legend in ancient times have reality, but they explain the story in a different way. So Saint Nicholas, having an old age, he's finished his course and he departed to be with the Lord on December 341 AD. Like we're talking about 4th century. He became as a bishop of Myra, and as a bishop he was for 40 years, and all the days of his life were around 80 years. So this is the story behind Santa Claus, or someone who leaves presents for children on Christmas Eve. Let us see how it developed to Santa Claus. So he is the greatest giver. He was famed all the ends of the earth, in many lands, among many people, even in the 21st century, even today. And by the way, there are so many churches worldwide in the West, many monasteries consecrated in his name. And in Russia especially, there is no single church without the name Nicolas Church. Anyway, let's see the development from Syriac all the way to Santa Claus. I'm going to speak about the Greek. I spoke a little bit about Mor Zokhe, the Greek East, then how it became to Latin West in the 11th century, how it spread, and then I'm going to speak about the Dutch tradition, Sinterklaas, which is the Dutch word from Saint Nicholas, and turned from Sinterklaas to Santa Claus. It was anglicized into English, and how modern developed it, modern traditions. But none of these transformations occurred in the Syriac-speaking world, just to tell you. That's only in the Western world, the development. Anyway, so in the 11th century, in the Latin, like it was associated with children and gift giving. How? Because we know that it started in the Greek, right? And in the translation of the Syriac hagiographies, which is the biographies, and the Greek took that story and applied it to Saint Nicholas. That's early. And then in the Byzantine period, the iconographic evolution started, showing him dressed in the vestment you see here, Byzantine period of a Byzantine hierarch, and that marked the first cultural reshaping of Mor Zokhe and Hellenized him to Saint Nicholas. Anyway, and then we have in the 11th century, because his reputation went to the West, from Greek monasteries in Myra to Italy, especially in a town called Bari in Italy. And in the year 1087, merchants from Bari and Venice from Italy set out all the way to Asia Minor, and their destination were to Antioch, Syria, for trade. And they proposed on the return trip to take up the relics of Saint Nicholas from Patara and transport them to Italy. And in this plan, the men of Bari commissioned the Venetians to land them at Myra. And 47 men, having armed themselves, set out for the church of Saint Nicholas in Patara. And the monk guards, like that monastery, and the monks there showed them the raised platform, and where beneath it was concealed the tomb of the saint and his relics. And on May 8, the ships arrived from Myra all the way to Italy in Bari with the relics of St. Nicholas, and soon it was joyful news, made it all around the city. And on the following day, May 9th, 1087, they transported the relics of St. Nicholas into a church called St. Stephen Church, situated not far from the sea, from Bari. And when they transferred the relics, it was a miraculous healing happening for the sick, and that brought a lot of reverence for the saint. And a year afterwards, a church was built in his name, St. Nicholas Church, and it was consecrated by the Pope Urban II. I'm talking about around 11th century, 1099. So the fame of St. Nicholas spread westward, intertwining with local customs. His association with children and protection led to the development of gift giving in Europe tradition, and during his feast day on 8th of May, and then spread in during the medieval times to Western Europe. And by the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas was venerated widely across Western Europe. His relics and stories traveled also, fostering devotion beyond the Greek East and blending with the local religious practices. And from the 11th century to the 13th century, tradition emerged where gifts were given on St. Nicholas' feast day. And the practice laid the foundation for later Christmas gift-giving customs in Europe. And then, as the saint reached northern Europe, is a lot of culture and folklore were emphasized in the gift-giving, winter visits, moral instructions for children. And then, when it came to the Dutch land in northern Europe and the Netherlands, St. Nicholas' name evolved from St. Nicholas to Sinterklaas in Dutch. And with this celebration became like part of Dutch culture identity and the idea of giving gifts, and that figure who arrives in winter to bring gifts, riding a horse and accompanied by helpers. This tradition combined religious and folk elements unique to Dutch culture. And in a Dutch mindset, he arrived with the steamboat, festive parades, and the giving of symbolic gifts and poems. And these rituals foster communion celebration and anticipation during the winter season. So Sinterklaas Festivus serves as a cultural pillar in the Netherlands, reinforcing like community and family spirit and celebration, marked by joy, generosity. It's a cultural heritage, anyway. And then, when the Dutch settlers carried Sinterklaas to colonial America, the name evolved linguistically from Sinterklaas to English Santa Claus. And this adaptation reflected linguistic shifts and the merging of also cultural shifts and traditions in a new context. And cultural forces in America reshaped again in the 19th century. Poems like A Visit from St. Nicholas. And there was a lot of illustration by American artists such as Thomas Nast, giving Santa his red attire and cheerful form. And other works like Clement Clarke Moore's The Night Before Christmas illustrates how it played a major role in shaping Santa Claus' personality and visual identity. And even the 19th century literature, art, media created the iconic image known worldwide today as Santa Claus with a red suit, sly, and reindeer, popularized through media, advertising, commercials today in the West, in America, and expansion so much that Christmas became Santa Claus and became so much commercial. And he became the beloved Christmas symbol worldwide. Anyway, to summarize, the transformation from Mor Zokhe to Saint Nicholas to the West as Santa Claus Any name you use, it's a rich cultural journey throughout centuries and continents. From a reverend Aramaic Mor Zokhe to a Greek bishop to an American icon, this evolution reflects the enduring power of legend and tradition in each culture. But Mor Zokhe's story, preserved in Syriac Aramaic tradition, offers timeless lessons on mercy, humility, and hidden charity. That we know why its origins was from Mor Zokhe Aramaic. We appreciate how these values define both personal virtue and communal identity. In serving others humbly, secretly, these are Syriac Aramaic values that developed throughout history to be a public giving festival, Santa Claus. Thank you so much.